It began with a scream, not of pain, but of something far more dangerous: betrayal. Not whispered behind palace walls or recorded in a clandestine tabloid sting, but shouted before a packed courtroom. Shouted in front of royal advisors, judges, guards, and a stunned global media who stood frozen in place. "It was Charles," she screamed. A voice, once polished and restrained, now hoarse with hysteria, reverberating across marble and history. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Within seconds, Queen Camilla, yes, Queen, was wrestled by security officers, her once immaculate cream coat rumpled as metal handcuffs snapped onto her wrists. Her hair, once brushed into silent perfection by a team of stylists, now hung wild in front of a face twisted by something raw. Rage, terror, or perhaps truth. Every camera in the room turned. Every journalist gasped. Even the judge paused mid-sentence, clearly not expecting the thunder that had just erupted from the dock. And within 60 seconds, the footage had gone viral. On YouTube, TikTok, the BBC, Telegram threads, royal fan pages, and anti-monarchist circles alike. Some were in disbelief. Others were already writing headlines. But all were asking the same question: why did Queen Camilla turn on her own husband? And more importantly, what if she was telling the truth? This is not just the story of a royal meltdown. This is the story of a carefully maintained illusion collapsing under the weight of decades-old secrets. It's the story of how a woman who climbed to the throne by surviving public hate, private shame, and impossible expectations may have finally broken, and in doing so, pulled the curtain back on one of the most haunting mysteries of the modern monarchy: the death of Princess Diana. But before we dive into what happened in that courtroom, before we dissect the charges, the evidence, the reaction from King Charles himself, we need to understand how he got here. Because this wasn't an impulsive outburst. It was the climax of a slow-burning fuse that had been lit long before Camilla ever wore a crown. Let's rewind the clock. Not to the trial, not even to Diana's funeral, but further, back to the days when a young Camilla Shand was introduced to Prince Charles at a polo match in 1970. She was clever, witty, charming, but in a way that was effortless. She didn't chase royal attention, and perhaps that's why she held it so tightly. But theirs was not a fairy tale. Not in the way the public wanted. The crown chose another woman for Charles, a demure, radiant young lady named Diana Spencer. And in that decision, history fractured. What followed was a war of glances, secrets, and heartbreak. Diana later revealed, in her own haunting words, "There were 3 of us in this marriage." For years, the British public saw Camilla as the villain, the other woman, the homewrecker who haunted a princess and humiliated a nation. She became a symbol of everything wrong with the institution: its cruelty, its favoritism, its inability to protect the very people it paraded as sacred. Yet somehow, through decades of cold stares and hostile headlines, Camilla endured. And more than that, she rose. When Queen Elizabeth II passed, the woman once booed in the streets became queen consort. Later, she was officially crowned queen. Not everyone agreed. Some refused to call her by the title. Others softened, swayed by her quiet loyalty to Charles, her patronage work, and the seeming stability she brought to a modernizing monarchy. But cracks remained. Whispers in the press, theories on Reddit, deeply embedded doubts that for all her smiles, Camilla still carried guilt not yet exposed. And then, the investigation. A second inquest into Diana's death. Unfinished business, some called it. A political stunt, others claimed. But behind the scenes, a former royal bodyguard began sharing documents. Time-stamped notes. Security anomalies. Gaps in the narrative. Suddenly, there were too many holes to ignore. Why were surveillance tapes missing? Why did Camilla visit certain locations in Paris 2 weeks before Diana's fatal crash, under assumed names, no less? Why had Charles insisted on private meetings with MI6 immediately afterward? These weren't just theories anymore. They were questions, dangerous ones. And Queen Camilla, by virtue of her position and proximity, found herself in the crosshairs of something she may have once thought buried for good. Still, no one expected this. Not a guilty verdict, not a public collapse, and certainly not an accusatory cry directed at the reigning monarch. When she screamed, "It was Charles," time stopped. People gasped, of course, but it wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them. Her voice cracked like a woman who had held a dam inside herself for too long. And as she was dragged out, tears streamed down her cheeks. Not performative, not theatrical, but desperate. The kind of desperation you only see when a person realizes they've been abandoned by the very structure they served. There were those in the courtroom who claimed she looked directly at the king. Others said she was looking at her lawyer, perhaps demanding he reveal something. Some claimed she mouthed something else as she passed the press pit. Something about Diana's file or the hidden reports. The footage is grainy. The angle is off. But it doesn't matter. The damage was done. The world saw it. Not just saw, felt it. That visceral moment of collapse. And what followed was an avalanche. Within minutes, British Twitter imploded. #ItWasCharles trended in over 42 countries. American networks scrambled to verify the courtroom footage. The BBC had to pause their royal programming and return live to the High Court. TikTok accounts dissected her scream. Lip readers claimed new translations, and podcasts began scheduling emergency Camilla crisis episodes. Buckingham Palace issued a terse, unconvincing statement that Camilla was experiencing stress and had deep love and respect for His Majesty. But nobody bought it. Because here's the thing, it wasn't just Camilla's words. It was the timing. The desperation, the years of secrecy leading to a single moment of collapse. Something about it felt true. And that's what terrifies the monarchy. You see, the royal family has always operated behind veils. Tradition, decorum, silence. When scandal erupts, they retreat. When truth threatens, they distract. But this was a queen turning on her king. In real time. On camera. With the world watching. There is no protocol for that. In the coming minutes, we'll examine everything that led to this moment. You'll hear the background of the trial, the charges leveled against Camilla, and why insiders believe this was never just about her. We'll pull back the layers of royal deceit, hear from key witnesses, analyze the role of King Charles, and reveal why this moment could change the future of the monarchy forever. But more than that, we'll try to understand Queen Camilla herself. Was she a victim? A mastermind? Or just someone who cracked under the unbearable weight of secrets and shame? Whatever the truth is, one thing is clear. This isn't the end of the royal story. It's the beginning of its most dangerous chapter yet. And it all started with a scream. The courtroom was unlike any other day. On this morning, history wasn't waiting patiently in books or documentaries. It was unfolding, live, minute by minute, in the heart of London's most secure legal chamber. Security had been heightened for weeks in anticipation of the verdict. Dozens of uniformed officers flanked every corridor. A limited number of press were allowed into the public gallery, their cameras facing forward but minds racing with questions too dangerous to ask out loud. The seats reserved for family and royal legal representatives were full. No one looked at each other. Every breath felt loaded, tense. The air itself seemed to hum with something unnatural, as if even the walls could sense that this would not be just another royal judgment. Outside, crowds had been gathering since dawn. Protesters, mourners, monarchists, anti-monarchists, curious citizens. Hundreds had taken their place beyond the police barricades, clutching photos of Princess Diana or holding signs that simply read, "Justice." Finally, inside the courtroom, Queen Camilla sat flanked by two senior defense attorneys. She wore a muted gray suit with thin pearl trim and a single brooch, reportedly gifted to her by Charles during their first overseas tour as a married couple. Her expression was unreadable, not solemn, not angry, simply still. Her hands were folded on her lap, barely moving. Occasionally, her right thumb would twitch against the edge of her fingernail, the only sign of nerves. The woman who had once stood at the center of the royal stage now sat in silence, facing the gravest accusation any member of the modern monarchy had ever encountered. The lead judge entered. A hush fell. The audience held their breath as the clerk stood and unfolded the verdict in a voice that cut through the weight of the room. Her Majesty Camilla Rosemary Shand Windsor, having been tried under charges of criminal conspiracy, obstruction of justice, perjury, and accessory to involuntary manslaughter in the matter of the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, this court finds you. A pause. Guilty on all counts. The silence that followed wasn't like the hush before. It was heavier. It had shape and substance. It filled the corners of the room like a fog no one knew how to navigate. There was no screaming, no gasps, just that silence, and then chaos. Camilla did not cry. She did not faint. What she did was far more haunting. She stood against the commands of her attorneys, against the instructions of the court, against decades of royal training that insisted on restraint above all things. Camilla stood, turned toward the gallery, and unleashed a scream that tore through centuries of quiet complicity. It was Charles. He knew everything. He made the calls. That was as far as she got before court-martials swarmed. 2 female guards grabbed her arms. One man pushed her back toward her seat. She resisted, not wildly, but with a strength that came from somewhere primal. Her voice cracked again. I protected him for years. I took the fall. Look at the tapes, they'll show. Her eyes scanned the gallery, locking for a split second with a journalist from a prominent UK paper. She mouthed something unintelligible. Another guard shouted for quiet. The judge banged his gavel, but the noise was no longer under control. Court staff scrambled to mute the room's microphones. Camilla was dragged from the room with her feet barely touching the ground. And just like that, the image was captured. Her coat open, her mouth mid-sentence, a look of frantic desperation on her face. That single frame became the thumbnail seen around the world. A queen, not in royal regalia, but in disgrace, crying out against her own husband, the King of England, in a moment so raw and unexpected that no royal historian could have ever prepared for it. Within minutes, news networks scrambled to break the story. Sky News cut away from its regularly scheduled coverage and played the clip in full. CNN interrupted a segment on American elections to cover the royal shockwave. Online, it was a different kind of explosion. TikTok users remixed the footage into music-backed clips. Twitter trended globally with the tag, #CamillaVerdict. One post read, "This isn't a royal scandal. It's a reckoning." But perhaps the most haunting response came from those closest to the monarchy. King Charles had not attended the hearing, officially citing constitutional precedent and a desire not to interfere with judicial proceedings. But palace insiders later claimed he was watching the live stream from a secure royal estate. According to leaked messages from one aide, the king dropped his glass of water and said nothing for over 2 hours after the outburst. Buckingham Palace released a sterile, cautious statement. It read, "Her Majesty the Queen is undergoing considerable emotional strain and will be receiving medical supervision as she prepares for the legal appeals process. His Majesty the King remains dedicated to public service and constitutional stability." No mention of Camilla's accusations. No denial. No affirmation. Just silence. Royal legal experts were already in overdrive. Could the verdict be appealed? Would she serve her sentence in a public facility or in a protected royal compound? Would her title be stripped? The United Kingdom had no roadmap for this situation. In the past, members of the royal family accused of wrongdoing either settled quietly, left public life, or were protected by opaque internal protocols. But this was uncharted territory. Beyond the legal implications, public sentiment shifted violently. Polls conducted within hours of the verdict showed a 38% surge in people calling for the abolition of the monarchy. Younger generations in particular expressed outrage, not just over the accusations themselves, but over the decades of perceived dishonesty and manipulation. Old footage of Diana resurfaced. Her BBC interview with Martin Bashir, her quotes about feeling isolated, hunted, betrayed. People began to ask if she had died, trying to tell a story no one wanted to hear. Was Camilla now confirming what Diana had tried to warn the world about? Or was she simply collapsing under the pressure, scapegoating the one man who had protected her longest? Meanwhile, legal scholars questioned what would come next. Would Charles now face questioning? Would Parliament demand an inquiry into royal immunity? Some suggested invoking the Treason Act, an archaic statute that had not been used in generations, but which technically allowed prosecution for crimes that threatened the stability of the realm. Others, more grounded, warned that even considering such a move could provoke constitutional crisis. But the most piercing questions weren't legal, they were emotional. What if Camilla was telling the truth? What if everything Diana had suffered wasn't just a result of bad marriage or public pressure, but deliberate, calculated moves from the highest echelons of power? And if that were true, what did it mean for Charles? For the monarchy? For the very idea of what the British royal family represents? As the sun began to set over London that evening, the gates of Buckingham Palace remained closed. Journalists stood clustered outside, cameras rolling on a building that had never seemed more impenetrable. Protesters held candles and Diana's photograph, singing Elton John's "Candle in the Wind." Others shouted slogans. Still others just stared, numb. The verdict had been delivered. A queen convicted. A kingdom in shock. And as the world waited for the next headline, one fact remained. The scream had happened. The accusation was out, and no amount of protocol could put it back. And deep inside the palace, behind reinforced walls and historic tapestries, one man sat alone. King Charles III, the man now accused, not in court, not officially, but in front of the world, by the one person he never thought would betray him. A verdict had been given, but the real judgment, it seemed, was only just beginning. Before the courtroom collapse, before the guilty verdict, before the cry that ignited a nation's fury, there was something far older at the root of this scandal, a relationship. Not a simple romance, not even a straightforward affair, but a slow-burning entanglement forged through status, silence, and shadow. The story of Camilla and Charles, now at the center of global disgrace, was once a whispered undercurrent in British society, known to some, tolerated by few, and never fully acknowledged until it was too late. To understand what happened in that courtroom, one must first understand what led to it. Not just legally, but emotionally, historically, and intimately. Because this was not merely about guilt. It was about trust, loyalty, survival, and betrayal. In 1970, Camilla Shand was not yet the queen, nor a duchess, nor even a serious contender for royal status. She was known within upper-class circles as spirited, confident, the type of woman who didn't flinch in the presence of royalty, but didn't fall over herself to impress them either. And that's precisely what drew Charles in. Their first meeting has since been mythologized, a polo match, a quick-witted exchange, a shared laugh over their mutual ancestry. Camilla is said to have teased Charles, saying, "My great-grandmother was your great-great-grandfather's mistress, so how about it?" It was bold, it was brash, and it worked. What followed was a courtship not unlike many others within the British aristocracy. Coded letters, discreet visits, and long conversations over the phone, often lasting deep into the night. But theirs was not the love story the crown wanted. Charles, then Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, was expected to marry someone pure in lineage, unburdened by prior relationships, someone deemed by the courtiers as suitable. Camilla, despite her breeding and social connections, had a history. She wasn't untouched. She wasn't moldable. And more importantly, she didn't wait. In 1973, while Charles was serving in the Royal Navy, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, a military officer and man about town, known for his affairs and his tolerance of hers. It was a union both practical and tragic, built on convenience and time rather than undying love. And yet, even after her marriage, the emotional connection between Camilla and Charles never truly broke. It simply adapted. They stayed in contact. Private lunches, late-night calls, interactions at social events, always under the watchful eyes of mutual friends and seasoned royal watchers. For a time, it was just another aristocratic entanglement, one of many hidden beneath the polished floors of British high society. But then came Diana. Lady Diana Spencer, barely 20 years old when she married Charles in 1981, brought something Camilla never had. Global adoration. Diana wasn't merely accepted by the public, she was exalted. A kindergarten teacher turned princess. She seemed to possess the very innocence the monarchy wanted to project. The engagement was rushed. The wedding watched by hundreds of millions. And from the start, something felt off. There was a photograph, later revealed in Diana's own interviews, that devastated her on the eve of the wedding. A gift from Charles to Camilla. A bracelet. The initials F and G for their nicknames, Fred and Gladys. Diana saw it. She wept. And yet, she went through with the ceremony, walking down the aisle not toward love, but toward an institution she would come to fear. Camilla remained on the sidelines, but not far. Diana knew. And more devastatingly, Charles never hid it as well as he thought. There were calls in the night, meetings during hunting trips, shared jokes during royal gatherings that left Diana feeling invisible. The three of them began to orbit each other in a psychological battle of power and pain. Diana fought back, not through confrontation, but through the media. She leaked stories. She gave interviews. She allowed the world to see the cracks in the perfect fairy tale. And when the infamous BBC Panorama interview aired in 1995, everything changed. "There were three of us in this marriage," she said, her voice shaking but steady. So it was a bit crowded. Camilla, for the first time, became a public villain. Overnight, she went from being a well-kept secret to a target of tabloid fury. She was chased by photographers, booed in the streets, branded a homewrecker, a mistress, a parasite. Her children were harassed, her family bombarded, and Charles, perhaps believing it was safer to let her take the heat, offered no public defense. That silence would linger. Diana's death in 1997 shocked the world. She was only 36. The circumstances of the crash, its location in Paris, the high-speed chase by paparazzi, the mysterious absence of royal protection, became immediate fodder for conspiracy. And in the shadows of those suspicions, the figure of Camilla stood quietly. She did not attend the funeral. She made no statement. For months, she vanished from the public eye. And then, slowly, she returned, not defiantly, but methodically. Charles began to appear with her in public, first at private functions, then at charity events. Eventually, at royal engagements. The public wasn't ready. Protesters stood outside appearances. Camilla endured eggs, insults, cold shoulders. But she stayed. She waited. And eventually, she was accepted. Not fully, not by all, but enough. When they married in 2005, it was done quietly. A civil ceremony, a modest blessing. Queen Elizabeth did not attend the legal signing, though she hosted a reception afterward. The message was clear: we acknowledge this union, but we do not celebrate it. Yet over time, Camilla rehabilitated her image. She became known for her humor, her advocacy for literacy and domestic abuse survivors, her quiet presence at Charles's side. She avoided the spotlight. She played the game. And then came her crowning. Upon Queen Elizabeth's death in 2022, there was speculation over what title Camilla would hold. Publicly, it was said she would be known as Queen Consort, but privately, plans had already been set. Within months, she was referred to simply as Queen Camilla. It was the final victory in a long, bruising campaign. And yet, beneath the surface, tensions persisted. Whispers about Diana never faded. Books continued to dig. New footage occasionally surfaced. Former staff spoke anonymously. Theories multiplied about the crash, the investigation, the documents sealed under royal privilege. And through it all, Camilla remained silent. But silence can be a mask. And masks, as history has proven, don't hold forever. The truth is that the royal family has always traded in appearances. Every smile, every outfit, every wave from a balcony is choreographed for meaning. But behind the facade, human frailty lingers. Secrets fester, alliances shift, and sometimes the very foundation cracks. For years, Camilla was painted as the woman who waited, who endured, who loved in silence. But perhaps the greater truth is that she was a survivor in a system that never protected anyone fully. Not even its own. And now, as the courtroom's fluorescent lights gave way to flashing cameras and viral headlines, the narrative reversed. The woman who once stole the heart of a future king now accused that king of being the architect of something far darker. Was it revenge? A desperate plea? Or the last act of someone who could no longer bear the weight of what she had once kept hidden? A royal love built on secrets can only last so long before it collapses under its own lies. And in Camilla's scream, the world heard not just anger, but something else. Maybe guilt, maybe grief, or maybe, finally, the truth. She was the princess the world loved. A woman who redefined royalty not through protocol, but through empathy. Not with silence, but with vulnerability. Not with distance, but with touch. And though decades have passed since her tragic death, Diana, Princess of Wales, continues to cast a long and chilling shadow over everything the British monarchy does. Especially over the lives of Charles and Camilla. But in the wake of Queen Camilla's courtroom collapse and explosive accusation, that shadow no longer merely lingers. It demands attention. Because while the public fixates on Camilla's verdict and viral scream, the deeper story is not about the queen who broke down, but about the woman whose death may have broken her. Diana never got the justice she deserved. She never got the full truth. She never got to explain what she saw, what she feared, or what she knew. But before her death, she left behind something even more dangerous than testimony, a trail of warnings. A haunting record of a woman surrounded by privilege but stripped of protection. It began subtly. Long before the crash, long before Paris, Diana sensed something closing in around her. A pressure, a silence, a watching presence. In private conversations with friends and journalists, she confided her fears. She told of strange behaviors. Phones clicking, cars that seemed to follow her, staff members who vanished after asking too many questions. She once described how her brakes had mysteriously failed in her car, and how a mechanic found nothing wrong with them after. She told confidants that if anything ever happened to her, people should look to the palace. In a letter dated October 1996, just a year before her death, she wrote to her butler Paul Burrell, "This particular phase in my life is the most dangerous. My husband is planning an accident in my car, brake failure and serious head injury in order to make the path clear for him to marry Tiggy." The note was chilling, the language unmistakably direct. Though dismissed by many at the time as paranoia or emotional distress, in the context of what came next, it has taken on an eerie prescience. And then there were her interviews, particularly the infamous Panorama interview with Martin Bashir. While the ethics behind how that interview was obtained have since come under scrutiny, the content remains seared into public memory. Diana described how isolated she felt within the royal family, how she was denied medical help when struggling with mental health, how she was made to feel irrelevant, even dangerous, once she no longer served the monarchy's narrative. The monarchy, she suggested, didn't protect her because it didn't want to. "I knew what my role was," she said, "but I also knew I was becoming too strong." It was a statement layered with double meaning. Diana had become a global icon, more beloved than the monarchy itself. She was a media powerhouse, capable of influencing public perception across nations. And perhaps that influence, that independence, became a threat to the tightly controlled royal apparatus. When Diana began dating Dodi Fayed in 1997, rumors swirled that she was preparing to move abroad, possibly even seeking U.S. citizenship. Some speculated she had access to royal secrets, particularly surrounding her own divorce proceedings and Charles's conduct. She was no longer an insider, but not yet a free woman. She existed in a dangerous limbo, publicly powerful but privately vulnerable. On August 31, 1997, that vulnerability was exploited in the most violent way imaginable. The crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel was declared an accident caused by a drunk driver fleeing paparazzi. That was the official story, but inconsistencies quickly emerged. Why were the CCTV cameras in the tunnel all turned off that night? Why were Diana and Dodi traveling without their usual security detail? Why was there a prolonged delay in getting Diana to a hospital, despite the proximity of emergency services? A French investigation concluded no foul play. A later British inquest acknowledged gross negligence, but not intentional harm. Still, the questions never died. And Camilla? She was silent. Her name never came up in any official capacity. She issued no public statement. When Charles flew to Paris to retrieve Diana's body, Camilla reportedly remained secluded, shielded from public scrutiny by palisades. But behind palace walls, her presence loomed. Because whether involved or not, she was the reason Diana had suffered, at least in the eyes of many. Over time, the world moved on. The royal family attempted to rehabilitate their image. Prince William and Prince Harry took on charitable causes in their mother's memory. Camilla emerged from the shadows, gradually accepted by the institution that had once hidden her. And for a while, it seemed Diana's memory would remain a private mourning, a chapter respectfully closed. Until the case reopened. Until new testimonies, old files, and unexplained communications between royal security officials brought the events of 1997 back into focus. Until investigators unearthed fragments, letters, call logs, names, previously sealed or ignored. And in the center of that swirling storm of re-examination stood one figure, Camilla. At first, the suggestion seemed outlandish. That Camilla, the once hated but now respected queen, might have had knowledge of or even influence over the circumstances of Diana's death. But as the prosecution's case unfolded, it wasn't about direct causality. It was about complicity, about knowledge, about what she didn't say, about what she may have concealed, about the people she protected and the consequences that followed. Prosecutors didn't need to prove that Camilla orchestrated the crash. They only needed to prove she obstructed justice in the years that followed, that she misled investigators, that she knew about threats to Diana's safety and said nothing, that she helped erase digital records, redirect attention, or maintain a cover-up that ultimately protected her own path to the throne. And that is where Diana's ghost returned. Not just as a memory, but as a witness. A silent witness whose life, words, and warnings took center stage once again. Not in the form of tears or tributes, but in timelines, letters, recordings, and courtroom exhibits. In the courtroom, her name was spoken with reverence. Her images displayed not as tabloid fodder, but as pieces of evidence. Her fears, once dismissed, were now reread with chilling validation. I was a threat. I knew too much. I saw too much, she had written in a journal found years after her death. To the jury, those weren't just words. They were cries for help ignored by a system built to protect royalty, not justice. And for Camilla, the weight of that history became unbearable. Because no matter how much time passed, no matter how many charity appearances or royal duties she performed, there was always a reckoning waiting. Diana's ghost had never left. It had simply been waiting for its moment. When Camilla screamed, it was Charles. Some believed it was a final act of desperation. Others believed it was a carefully timed truth. But perhaps the most unsettling possibility is this, that in that moment, she wasn't thinking about legal strategies or political survival. Perhaps she was thinking about Diana, about the woman whose pain she had once dismissed, about the warnings she had helped bury, about the role she played, actively or passively, in a death that haunted not only a nation but her own conscience. Because guilt isn't always about what you do. Sometimes it's about what you allow, what you accept, what you ignore. And now, the world is asking, if Camilla carried the weight of those secrets all these years, what did Charles carry? If she broke under the pressure, what kind of truths still remain unspoken inside Buckingham Palace? Diana's voice, long silenced, now echoes louder than ever. Through documents, through court transcripts, through the emotional wreckage of a trial that has upended the very structure of monarchy. She once said, "I want to be a queen of people's hearts." Perhaps she always was. Perhaps she still is. And perhaps now, finally, the truth she fought so hard to tell is no longer just a ghost. It's a reckoning. Paris has always been a city of beauty and mystery, a place where history and modernity collide in stunning contrast. But on the night of August 31st, 1997, it became a city defined by tragedy. The Pont de l'Alma tunnel, an otherwise unremarkable stretch beneath the glimmering lights of the Seine, was transformed into the epicenter of one of the most controversial deaths in modern history. Diana, Princess of Wales, icon, humanitarian, mother, died in that tunnel. And from the moment the first sirens pierced the silence, questions began forming that have never been fully answered. Nearly 3 decades later, those questions still echo. And now, with Queen Camilla convicted and her courtroom scream sending shockwaves through the monarchy, investigators have been forced to re-examine what they once allowed to remain buried. What did the Paris files truly contain? Why were so many inconsistencies overlooked? Who benefited from the silence? And how deep did the cover-up truly go? In the immediate aftermath of the crash, French authorities responded with speed, but their findings left gaping holes. Henri Paul, the driver of the Mercedes carrying Diana and Dodi Fayed, was blamed for being intoxicated, speeding, and attempting to outrun a mob of paparazzi. It was a neat narrative, convenient, easy to digest, and damning enough to absolve any larger responsibility. But behind that facade, the facts began to unravel. First, the issue of the surveillance footage. The Pont de l'Alma tunnel was known to have multiple CCTV cameras. On any given night, the traffic footage in that area was constant. Yet on the night of the crash, not a single functioning video feed was recovered. Authorities claimed the cameras weren't recording or were directed elsewhere. But no one explained why that night, of all nights, a string of technical failures coincided to leave the tunnel completely blind. Then came the matter of the ambulance. Eyewitnesses at the scene reported that Diana was alive, conscious, and speaking when paramedics arrived. However, instead of rushing her to the nearest hospital, a mere 4-minute drive away, they spent over an hour on site before finally transporting her. When questioned, French emergency services cited medical protocol, claiming her injuries required stabilization before movement. Yet trauma experts have long contested this decision. Had she been delivered to surgery faster, some argue, she may have survived. Autopsy reports, too, were met with skepticism. Dodi Fayed's father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, publicly challenged the findings, demanding an independent investigation. He alleged foul play, suggesting that Diana and Dodi were killed to prevent a marriage that would tie the future king's children to a Muslim family. For years, his claims were dismissed as paranoid ramblings, until pieces of supporting evidence quietly began to surface. Evidence never fully explored by the original inquiry. One of the most disturbing elements came from the personal belongings found in the wreckage. Diana's handbag, famously large and always filled with personal items, had been emptied. Some contents were never catalogued. A camera she was believed to be carrying was missing. Dodi's phone, last used to send a message hours before the crash, was reportedly wiped before it was returned to the family. No explanation was ever given. When pressed, French officials claimed they had no further comment. And then there were the witnesses. People who saw things that didn't fit the narrative. A man named Francois Levister claimed he saw a flash of light moments before the crash, something he believed was used to blind the driver. Another witness, a photographer who arrived on the scene early, later testified that he saw a man in a dark suit standing over the wreckage moments before emergency services arrived. Both of these testimonies were later discredited by authorities, yet the inconsistencies in their treatment raised eyebrows. Over the years, independent journalists and researchers compiled these loose threads into unofficial dossiers, what came to be known as the Paris Files. Many of these were stored online, passed quietly through forums, encrypted drives, and even dark web repositories. But others were physical, consisting of scanned reports, handwritten notes, and off-the-record interviews with former royal staff and intelligence officers. For years, these files were dismissed. But when the Camilla trial began, everything changed. As part of the prosecution's effort to establish a pattern of concealment and interference, the court allowed certain classified documents to be reintroduced. Among them, internal communications between MI6 agents operating in Paris the week of Diana's death. The contents were redacted, but timestamps and headings suggested surveillance operations unrelated to paparazzi or standard security. One document, dated August 30th, 1997, referenced an asset mobilization near Place de l'Alma, with visuals confirmed on Primary. No names, no context, but the implication was staggering. Further revelations came from digital forensics. A recently retired intelligence analyst, whose identity was kept anonymous under witness protection, testified that encrypted data packages from that time showed signs of manipulation. Emails between royal security liaisons and foreign intelligence officials were altered, with timestamps suggesting changes occurred days or even weeks after the crash. When cross-referenced against the original logs obtained through backdoor server access, discrepancies emerged. Entire blocks of communication were deleted. Others were subtly rewritten. And then came the voice files. Buried in an archive labeled non-urgent royal transfers, investigators discovered audio messages recorded by Diana in the final months of her life. One message, sent to her close friend Rosa Monckton, revealed her state of mind with chilling clarity. "They want me gone," she said. "It's not a feeling, Rosa. It's something I know. They're done with me. I don't fit anymore." Another, recorded privately and never sent, was more cryptic. "There's a plan. They won't do it in the open. It'll look like something else, but it won't be." In court, these messages were presented not as definitive proof of murder, but as evidence of intent, proof that Diana herself believed she was being silenced. For Camilla's defense team, this was dangerous territory. Their client wasn't accused of planning the crash, but of helping to bury the truth. The messages reinforced the idea that a cover-up had occurred, and that Camilla, by virtue of her relationship and proximity to Charles, may have had access to key information. More damning still were hotel records from Paris that placed Camilla in the city just days before Diana's arrival. Under a pseudonym, Veronica C. Belsom, she stayed at a luxury suite not far from the Ritz Hotel, where Diana and Dodi were last seen. When questioned about the visit, Camilla initially denied it. Only when faced with security footage from the hotel's lobby did she concede. Her explanation? A personal retreat, unrelated to the royal schedule. But critics asked the obvious question: why the secrecy? Why the false name? And why choose Paris, of all cities, during such a sensitive time? In the courtroom, prosecutors painted the image of a woman complicit not through action, but through silence. She didn't need to order a crash, they argued. All she needed to do was stand by while evidence was buried, while questions were silenced, and while the narrative was tightly controlled. It was obstruction not by omission, but by design. Perhaps the most unsettling moment came when a former royal security officer broke ranks. Speaking under a court order, he described a meeting that took place 1 week after Diana's funeral. Present in the room: Charles, Camilla, a private legal counsel, and 2 senior aides. According to the officer, the meeting F. How to manage perception. How to ensure that no future inquiry could link members of the royal family to anything beyond public mourning. When asked why he didn't speak out earlier, the officer replied simply, "Because back then, doing so would have destroyed me. Now, silence would destroy everything else." These revelations rocked the courtroom. But more than that, they reignited the public's fury. People demanded to see the Paris files in full. Social media campaigns began. Hashtags like #OpenTheFiles and #JusticeForDiana exploded globally. Protests formed outside French embassies, urging their government to release unredacted reports. Buckingham Palace, once again, went quiet. Charles canceled 2 public engagements, citing the emotional toll of recent developments. No statements were made, no explanations offered, but for millions around the world, the silence spoke volumes. The truth about what happened in Paris that night may never be fully known. But one thing is certain: there was more to the story than the world was told. Files were hidden, records were altered, and key players, whether through fear, loyalty, or ambition, chose silence over justice. And now, with Queen Camilla's outburst shattering decades of royal discipline, the pressure to uncover everything has never been greater. What else lies buried beneath the City of Lights? And more importantly, who still stands to lose if those secrets come to light? No one expected it to come to this. For decades, Queen Camilla was carefully repositioned from royal pariah to respected consort, then queen. A long arc of image rehabilitation built not on apologies, but on time. Time that slowly dulled the memory of scandal and replaced it with carefully curated appearances, smiles, and silence. The palace had learned from past mistakes. The tabloid storm that once followed her every step was eventually replaced with disinterest, then acceptance. The Camilla of 2005 was not the Camilla of 1995. And the Camilla of 2023, when the investigation into Diana's death was quietly reopened, was expected to remain untouched, untouchable, until she wasn't. The trial that followed would become one of the most scrutinized legal proceedings in modern royal history. Not only because of the charges themselves, but because of what it symbolized: that even royalty, when confronted with enough evidence and public pressure, could no longer hide behind ceremony. It began with a whistleblower. An anonymous tip delivered to a private investigative firm contained fragments of documents, burned at the edges, watermarked with long-defunct departmental codes. What they revealed was enough to reopen the cold case surrounding Diana's death, not from the angle of the crash itself, but from the actions taken afterward. Suppression of key witness statements, manipulated security footage logs, a pattern of institutional deflection. The name Camilla appeared in a footnote referencing royal communication directives issued days after the incident. It was thin, but it was a start. From there, a cascading series of testimonies unraveled the facade. A retired intelligence officer admitted that certain phone recordings and movement logs involving the royal household were sealed under pressure. A former royal aide confessed that Camilla had access to private briefings meant only for security and legal teams in the aftermath of the crash. Camilla's name wasn't on any official orders, but her fingerprints were all over the obstruction. The charges were severe: criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice, perjury and prior sworn statements to royal investigators, and knowingly aiding in the suppression of evidence tied to a fatal investigation. Not one of the charges directly accused her of planning the crash, but they didn't have to. The trial wasn't about the act. It was about the aftermath, about what was hidden, and why. The courtroom proceedings were a surreal mix of old-world tradition and modern-day spectacle. The defendant's box had never before held a sitting queen. Cameras were banned from the room, but sketches of Camilla seated stiffly behind glass, flanked by barristers and security, flooded every newspaper. Outside, protesters gathered daily, demanding the full truth behind Diana's death, some holding signs with quotes from Diana's letters, others chanting for monarchy abolition. The prosecution opened its case with a simple but devastating statement. This is not a trial of status. This is a trial of silence, of deliberate suppression, of power abused in the name of preservation. They outlined a web of communications that showed Camilla's involvement in decisions to delay disclosures to the press, pressure investigators to abandon leads, and redirect internal security reviews away from royal family oversight. The most damning evidence was a memo, initially redacted, later revealed in full, showing Camilla's handwritten notes advising Charles's legal team on how to minimize external speculation and shield sensitive figures. Among those figures, MI6 operatives, French intelligence contacts, and unnamed royal security advisors. Her defense team countered with a carefully constructed argument. Camilla was not obstructing justice, but protecting the dignity of the royal family in the face of unprecedented tragedy. They argued that she had no formal authority over investigations, that any input she offered was advisory and filtered through official channels. They painted her not as a mastermind, but a woman thrust into a maelstrom of grief, loyalty, and political chaos, doing her best to stabilize a fractured institution. But the prosecution pressed harder. They brought in palace insiders, former aides, and, crucially, Diana's former private secretary, who testified that Camilla had lobbied against reopening the crash investigation in 2004. The reason? Because she feared it would resurface connections that had long since been buried. The most explosive moment came when the prosecution revealed encrypted communications recovered from a now-deceased royal cybersecurity advisor. Messages between Charles's inner circle and Camilla's legal advisors appeared to strategize around limiting liability and protecting primary succession figures. The messages were dated barely 2 weeks after the Paris crash. Though Charles was never formally named as a defendant, his presence loomed over every word. When Camilla was asked on the stand why she had concealed her 1997 visit to Paris under an alias, her answer was chillingly evasive. I needed privacy. I was grieving in my own way. When pressed on why she never disclosed that trip to investigators, she said, "No one asked, but someone had." Court records from the original inquiry showed that all senior royals were requested to disclose any travel activity in the month surrounding Diana's death. Camilla's name appeared in a compliance log, but with a "no international travel reported" note beside it. Her signature followed. When confronted with this discrepancy, Camilla faltered. For the first time in the trial, her composure cracked. Her lips tightened. She glanced toward her legal counsel. Her voice trembled. "I wasn't trying to deceive. I didn't believe that trip was relevant." The jury didn't believe her. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted on the monarchy. Constitutional experts debated whether the king himself could be called to testify. There was talk of issuing subpoenas to palace archivists. Some feared that if the trial reached too deeply into the monarchy's secrets, the institution might never recover. And perhaps that was the point, because Camilla's trial wasn't just about what she did or didn't do. It was about the machinery that enabled her, the system that allowed a woman who once wore the crown to sit in the courtroom as a defendant, while the man she screamed about still ruled. In the closing statements, the prosecution returned to a central theme: accountability. "This case is not about a queen," the lead prosecutor said. "It is about a citizen who, by birth or marriage, should never be immune to justice." Camilla did not testify again after her initial cross-examination. But in the final moments of the trial, when asked if she wished to make a statement before sentencing, she rose. Her words were brief, but unforgettable. I never wished harm on anyone. I tried to protect those I loved. And if that makes me guilty, then I accept it. But as she turned to walk back toward her seat, her foot caught slightly. Her balance faltered, and she said, audibly, but without looking back, "He should be here too." The words were not entered into court record. They weren't acknowledged by the judge, but everyone heard them, and by the next morning, they were on every headline in the world. The throne was meant to be his sanctuary. For decades, Charles had waited patiently, enduring personal scandal, public scrutiny, and a complicated love story that spanned generations, until finally, he ascended. King Charles III. It was a moment heralded by royal loyalists as a long-overdue era of continuity. But as the dust settled from Queen Elizabeth II's passing and Charles took his place atop a centuries-old institution, a darker legacy was quietly circling beneath the polished veneer of royal protocol. The trial of Queen Camilla was supposed to stop just short of him. A carefully constructed legal perimeter ensured that Charles would remain insulated, an uninvolved sovereign, separate from the machinations that led to his wife's conviction. But Camilla's explosive courtroom breakdown shattered that plan. Her four words, "It was Charles," resonated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. They ripped open a decades-old wound, one that had never fully healed since Diana's tragic death in 1997. And in doing so, they thrust the king into a position he had long feared, not as monarch, but as suspect. The public reaction was immediate and unforgiving. News anchors, previously careful with royal language, began speculating openly about Charles's involvement. Editorials questioned whether his silence was strategic or cowardly. Hashtags like #KingOfLies and #CharlesKnew trended worldwide. Polls showed a steep drop in public trust, particularly among younger Britons, with more than half stating they believed Charles should temporarily relinquish duties until a formal inquiry could be launched. But what did Charles know? And what had he done? To understand his role, we must revisit the weeks surrounding Diana's death. While the official narrative positioned Charles as a grieving ex-husband who rushed to Paris to retrieve the mother of his children, behind closed doors, a far more strategic picture was forming. According to confidential testimonies and long-suppressed records now submitted in court, Charles held a private meeting with senior members of MI6 just days after the crash. The subject, damage control, not grief counseling. Not security upgrades. Damage control. Former intelligence staff, protected under anonymity, revealed that the purpose of this meeting was to assess what Diana may have had in her possession: personal diaries, recordings, letters, items that, if made public, could jeopardize the monarchy. The existence of such documents had been rumored for years, but it wasn't until forensic archivists began reviewing electronic communications from that time that references to priority neutralization began to appear. These terms, buried deep in classified reports, were never defined. But the context implied containment, removal, and suppression. One such report contained an entry labeled, Op Albatross, contingency if Diana materials reach foreign press. The file, redacted and dated only days before Diana's funeral, bore a signature code linked directly to Clarence House communications. And it wasn't just bureaucratic fluff. Attached was a chain of command involving private palace legal teams, intelligence liaisons, and a small cluster of royal advisors, some of whom, according to documents now unsealed, reported directly to Charles. Then there's the matter of Camilla's trip to Paris. During the trial, it emerged that Camilla had visited Paris in the days leading up to the crash. What wasn't publicly known until investigators traced financial logs and hotel security footage was that Charles had coordinated portions of that trip. He had authorized the use of a royal security retainer to monitor her location. Emails recovered from an encrypted palace archive show his direct knowledge of her lodging, her alias, and even her departure time. In one message, sent to a senior royal advisor, Charles wrote, "Ensure discretion. This is sensitive even now." At the time, that message could be interpreted as a routine concern about media exposure. But in the context of everything else, Diana's looming public presence, the growing rift within the family, and the swirling rumors of her potentially marrying Dodi Fayed, it suddenly carries the weight of foreknowledge. Not necessarily of a crash, but of something being handled behind the curtain. And this brings us to the most damning piece of circumstantial evidence yet, a private memo recovered from a former palace legal archivist, detailing an emergency protocol draft that had never been activated until August 31st, 1997. The document, titled Regal PR Emergency Response, Tier 1, laid out guidelines for immediate media control, public statement drafting, and succession implications in the event of unforeseen loss or scandal affecting royal associates. While the document had been created years earlier, notes in the margins suggested it had been updated in July of 1997. The initials CPW appeared beside several of the edits. Charles Philip Windsor. Legal analysts in the Camilla trial did not submit this document as formal evidence, citing chain of custody concerns. But its existence was enough to shift public perception. Was Charles planning for Diana's death, or preparing for a scenario he feared might spiral beyond the monarchy's control? The difference between guilt and survival instinct suddenly felt terrifyingly thin. Throughout the trial, Charles remained conspicuously silent. His advisors released tightly worded statements. His Majesty remains committed to his constitutional role. The king offers no comment during ongoing legal proceedings. Behind palace gates, sources described him as withdrawn, tense, rarely seen by staff. One palace insider, speaking off the record, described him as a man watching the walls of his world tremble. Even more curious was his interaction with Camilla after her sentencing. Though no official statement of support was made, Charles privately visited her twice during her initial detention period. Both meetings conducted off the books, with no press allowed. What was said during those visits remains unknown, but one detail leaked. During the second meeting, Camilla reportedly refused to take his hand when offered. A small gesture, but a symbolic fracture in what was once considered one of the monarchy's most enduring partnerships. And what of Prince William and Prince Harry? William, ever the dutiful heir, issued a brief statement asking for space and dignity for all involved. Yet behind the scenes, whispers emerged of his growing unease. Staff described him as distant from his father, reportedly requesting that Charles not be involved in any of his public appearances. Harry, on the other hand, was far more direct. Through his representatives, he called for a full and transparent inquiry into all parties with knowledge of the events leading to and following our mother's death. It was the first time either brother had publicly implicated the broader royal apparatus. These divergent reactions only deepened public suspicion. Could it be that even Charles's sons harbored doubts about their father's role? The British Parliament began to feel the pressure. Within weeks of the verdict, a group of MPs called for an independent royal commission, an unprecedented investigation into the actions of senior royals during key historical moments. Though largely symbolic, it marked a turning point. The immunity traditionally afforded to the monarchy, long upheld as an untouchable principle, was now on the table. Charles, for all his experience and patience, seemed unprepared for the storm. Advisors reportedly begged him to issue a televised address, to acknowledge the pain, deny wrongdoing, and reassure the nation. But he declined. "The moment I speak," he allegedly said, "is the moment I lose." And yet, by staying silent, he may have lost even more. Because in the court of public opinion, silence is not neutrality, it is complicity. Especially when that silence follows the anguished scream of a queen who once protected you. The question remains, is Charles a man burdened by events he could not control, or a sovereign who placed his future above the truth? Did he stand by as evidence was buried, or was he its architect? Was Camilla's breakdown the act of a woman betrayed, or the final unraveling of a shared deception? These are the questions now haunting the monarchy. The king continues his ceremonial duties, cutting ribbons, attending summits, offering blessings. But every appearance is now shadowed by doubt, every smile dissected, every word analyzed. And behind palace walls, one question continues to echo through the gilded corridors. If Camilla was guilty of protecting the crown, what, then, does that make the king? It was the kind of moment that happens once in a generation. 1 second, the courtroom was a place of tight decorum and careful silence. The next, it became a stage for history, for words, spoken in desperation and rage, shattered decades of carefully constructed illusion. It was Charles, Queen Camilla's voice, hoarse, frantic, rising above the polished voices of lawyers and clerks, cut through the air like a blade. What followed was chaos, not only in the courtroom, but in every corner of the internet, the media, and public consciousness. The monarchy's veneer of untouchable mystique cracked in real time, and within minutes, the entire world was watching. It began with a single video. A junior journalist from a mid-tier news outlet had managed to sneak in an audio recording device linked to a real-time transcription program. Though officially barred from capturing video, the reporter's companion outside the courtroom, holding a phone pressed against an earbud, filmed the screen as Camilla screamed those now infamous words. The audio was muffled, distorted slightly by the courtroom acoustics, but unmistakable. It was Charles, followed by the clattering of chairs, the shrieks of guards, the shouts of lawyers. That footage was posted less than 90 seconds later, with a caption, "Breaking, Camilla screams King Charles's name in courtroom meltdown." It exploded. The first platform to seize it was Twitter. Within minutes, Camilla was trending. 10 minutes later, it was Charles overtook it. TikTok accounts began uploading lip-synced recreations, emotional reaction videos, slow-motion edits set to ominous music. One account, specializing in royal conspiracy theories, layered the audio over grainy footage of Diana from the 1990s, captioned, "She tried to tell us." That post alone garnered 40 million views in under 24 hours. The footage wasn't limited to Gen Z audiences either. BBC's emergency bulletin interrupted programming to verify the authenticity of the recording. CNN played the audio with a somber panel of analysts dissecting every syllable of Camilla's cry. "Is this a queen's mental breakdown?" asked one host. "Or the beginning of the monarchy's unmaking?" But the question was,